So here we are, finally at Renaissance art. I think this is probably the most exciting part of the Renaissance. We can actually see the impact of what the ideas and values of Renaissance were about and how they were being expressed through art and architecture. So we'll be going over a few pieces just as examples, but we'll be looking at the different artists in detail in class. So this is just an overview of understanding what Renaissance art has to offer. The focus really begins that people are preoccupied with each other, right? Everything is focused on the human, and we talked about this as humanism was a literary movement, and Renaissance really valued the individual, right? And each man had a limitless potential. So that's the focus. And this is going to fall into painting, sculpture, and architecture. There's going to be a new sense of reality and a new sense of space. And the occupation of people's minds upon human beings is saying that, you know, that their minds are of this world, right? They're very worldly in the sense of what's happening now, not what's happening in the afterlife, and it's very different from the Middle Ages, as we discussed before. The idea of space was no longer this mystery and divine created thing. It's not unknowable, but actually human beings are the ones who are taking up this space, fulfilling this space, living in this space, and they could imagine themselves, right, in control of the space around them. When we look at a different art piece, so if we look at a painting or a sculpture, we can actually identify what it is exactly. We don't actually have to look too deeply into it. If you know, we didn't have patrons during the Renaissance, there really wouldn't be art at all. And so the flourishing, right, should be really credited to the amount of wealth and the families that have acquired this wealth to pay and to buy these luxurious things, to hire and commission artists to do so. So as we know, a lot of powerful families, they had a lot of wealth that's from commerce and, you know, having businesses, and they're even in high offices of city and state governments. The thing about the patrons is that they invested their money into art. It wasn't so much just they had so much they didn't know what to do with it, but they saw that if I were to pay and hire someone to do a portrait of me, right, this is going to show that I have the money to do so, right? I'm of a social status, and the public can see this about me. So like it lifts up the public image, and oftentimes they would draw up a lot of detailed contracts about what type of materials to be used, how much work should be done by the master artist, and different patrons would write, you know, lengthy contracts to specify what exactly are they looking for. Okay. Many patrons would demand for works to be done in public squares, right? Whether it's architecture or some sculptures are in the squares. You go to Florence now, there's a lot of sculptures that are in the different plazas and palazzos, which are homes. In the Middle Ages, you know, there weren't these wealthy families around. Really, it was just the church that was the greatest patron, but now that's shifting. Okay, so make sure you're keeping in mind of the different shifts that's happening between the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Commission workers, you have artists, you have poets, musicians. They were all very eager because they wanted to see themselves be part of the patricians' families, and they realized that, you know, all their expenses would be paid for. They would have, you know, a time outside of the workshop to work, and they were highly esteemed. They were no longer just artisans, but they were artists, right? They were revered for their capabilities. Some humanists would also want to be commissioned, and they would fill the roles, as we said before, like as historians to write impressive letters, or state secretaries. They would be tutors even for wealthy families, and they would even be orators, and they would be part of the papal court. And over time, humanists would begin to develop this type of sarcastic and cynical standpoint where they're very sharp-tongued and very biting. And they would make fun of secular leaders, church leaders, those of higher rank above them. And this is kind of like the culture that was developing out of that too. Okay? All right, so we talked about the focus of art. Now we're going to jump into the purpose of art. So the outcome is essentially wealthy families are going to commission works. Okay, different works are going to be created, and it's going to demonstrate that they have leadership and the right to govern in whatever city-state they're a part of. And so many wealthy families are going to try to use the art to show a certain image, right, that they want of themselves, and saying, paint a picture of me that's like this, and they're really trying to impress other people in these pieces. One huge example is going to be portraiture. Okay, this is going to lift up the subject, glorify the subject, and really celebrate the individual. I have an example right here. And even for some, it doesn't look that pleasing, but just having something of you shows just your significance in society. Okay, the Medici family, as we mentioned, were great patrons of the arts, very secular. They would commission buildings for themselves, chapels. They would even restore monasteries. Cosimo, we talked about Cosimo de' Medici. He hired Michelangelo, right, and he created a family tomb for the Medicis in Florence as well. Okay, so art essentially represented a combination of two things. First is the individual talent of the artist, right? Each artist has its own type of styling that they're specifically known for, but also to carry out those important ideas and values of society. Okay, they're really capturing the spirit of society and putting it into marble or putting it into an acrylic, and that's the fresco or whatever, and that's essentially how people would view and understand the world around them. So some of the new developments that came through art was that artists were trying to figure out how to improve the technique and the styling of painting and sculptures and all these things. So they're going to introduce perspective to rectify the problem of being two-dimensional and trying to make it more realistic, right? And that's one new development. Also, the new development that the artwork that they're trying to accomplish, these artists are recognizing that the city-states that they live in, the urban environment, needed more of a civic architecture on a grand scale, a place where people would attend to that is not necessarily just the monastery, right? But buildings need to be places where many would be a part of, many would respect, many would be visiting and understanding as a beautiful building in itself. Okay, so let's talk about architecture. Architecture is going to be the most dominant discipline of the Renaissance, and the buildings itself, as you can see here with Brunelleschi's dome of the cathedral in Florence, the buildings are going to be way more costly than any other painting or sculpture that's going to be made because it's the grand scale of it. And the patrons, if they were able to back this financially, right, would probably get the most fame in saying, wow, like you were able to construct this instead of just that one painting like in their house of the portrait of themselves, right? So you just imagine to scale of what this really means. Now, wealth is one that is needed, but in addition to just having the finances to create something so grand, you need to have a lot of technical knowledge. So during the Renaissance, the architecture is essentially the designer of it, right? The contractor, the one that's going to figure out how to actually construct it, right? Part of the construction crew, and also the inspector to make sure that it's up and it's going to be stable. And so all of these were part of just one rule of the architect. But nowadays that has really changed, right? So if you had the skill, the technical knowledge of how buildings are constructed at all, right? You were highly valuable in what you could offer into architecture. We mentioned that in the Middle Ages, right, it started from Romanesque architecture going into Gothic, and by 1400 the Gothic style had dominated for about 200 years, right, from 1200 to 1400, and the Gothic structures had long spires. We talked about how they were trying to be as high as possible to represent they were reaching the heavens, and they had, the vaulted ceilings and the pointed arches and the flying buttresses and all that kind of stuff. But that began to change, and Brunelleschi is the one who would challenge the Gothic style and really implement more classical influence from the Greco-Roman world, and suggest that we should go back to a lot of the pillars that were from the Roman Empire, and also a lot of geometric designs, different planes and spheres. So if you look at the dome, Brunelleschi's dome in the Cathedral of Florence, right? He used a lot of perspective in the sense of the geometric shapes of the circular windows, and then you also have these square panels, which are inside like this rectangle as well, and then you have the rounded arches, and so you provide a lot of perspective and symmetry and all that kind of stuff, as we talked about the classical virtues and the values of moderation and balance and symmetry. That's part of Parthenon. Okay, all right. For sculpture, I'm going to refer to a lot of the examples Donatello was, because he was a great sculptor. Sculptures actually were influenced by, of course, we know classical pieces from the Greco-Roman world. The 3D forms that the Greeks and the Romans really aspired and really idealized, that was kind of easily translated from the classical period to the Renaissance period, and these 3D types of how it looks, it's easier to replicate than say like a painting, because the human form is something that like people can see and they can try to replicate based upon what their eyes are focused on the people, right? Donatello is going to take some of those muscular examples and reduce that bulky buffness, as we remember the disc thrower, right? And just make them a little bit more natural. And he would show them with these long flowing robes, and then in most of his works, he would show that everything is kind of more curved and not as much sharp angles, and that he's going to introduce the freestanding statue. So what signifies a freestanding statue is essentially there's nothing that's supporting it. It's not like held up against a wall, right? There's no supporting beam or plank behind it. And this allows more attention to the anatomy of the human being, because from all angles you can kind of see just the details of it and the realistic proportions of the human being. Here you have Judith slaying Holofernes, and this is really symbolizing the love of the Florentines to get rid of tyrants, right? Even though that they had the Medici family, right? It's very, very ironic, and they love liberty and being free from that, right? And so it's from a Greek myth. Okay. Also, we have the equestrian statues. Okay, these are basically just guys on horses, but he would revive this. Donatello would revive this, and showing that there's a linear perspective that depended upon where the viewer stood, they can see like this overpowering effect. Most of the time, like the ones that I saw when I went to Europe, okay, these equestrian statues are going to be on these giant slabs of marble, right? Essentially, that they're higher up, and to look upward at them to have this effect. On the bottom, you have Victor Emmanuel II, the king to unite Italy in the 1800s. Okay, and then on the top, you have Donatello's Gattamelata. He's a Gondotri, and he's in part of the Venetian army general fighter that was hired for Venice. Okay, so these are some of the examples of statues. We'll go over more in class. Okay, all right. So painting, the last of the three major art forms. Painting really began as a craft, not as an art. And what that means is that there wasn't a huge social status in saying, oh, like you're a painter, like I automatically respect you for your skill. It was more of a mechanical art and saying like, oh, I know how to paint, I can fulfill this role. and can complete this craft. And it's not like you had to have like a huge amount of education like a humanist would, and studying and analyzing that kind of stuff. And for example, Michelangelo, one of the greatest Renaissance painters, his dad actually discouraged him from doing this type of pursuing art, because like if you were to become a sculptor, right? But we know Michelangelo made his David, right? If you were to be a sculptor, he says, well, you're just a stone cutter, right? So it wasn't even seen at a level. Art wasn't seen as a level initially, as being an artist. It was just like you're just a craftsman, essentially. Most artists were sons of shopkeepers in the city, and they were part of, over time became more luxurious in the trades that they would do, and they would just be starting off as artisans, right? And only like we saw in the video, only those that were really talented could really make, their 15 minutes of fame, 15 years of fame, of where they're really contributing great works of art because their talent is recognized. How was painting transformed? Well, essentially, many people of the Renaissance believed in Plato, a Greek philosopher. Plato's ideas of eternity, and saying that these values and virtues of beauty, of truth, of goodness exists every day, and humans have embodied these things, right? Their souls show these things, and we should bring these beautiful things, these truthful and good things out. And this is exactly in line with the humanists were thinking, in saying that you could actually bring these things out of nature to understand the ideas. What does beauty look like? How do we capture that? And so over time, they're going to change the way that they paint, and it's become more and more realistic. Okay. Nature is going to be, highlighted way more. Okay, there's going to be less embellishment in art. Okay, and you're going to have everyday objects that are just part of painting, and so this beauty is going to be kind of highlighted in different ways. Okay, I'm going to mention perspective now. It's going to be part of the next slide, but in these examples, okay, in the first one you have the Last Supper. Right, and the Last Supper in perspective allows you to have like a 3D effect in understanding. Right, so you have a vanishing point and converging lines in the horizon line, and the disciples are all in the same line. Right, but the vanishing point goes outwards, showing that towards the back wall there's those windows. It's not just like right behind Jesus, right? And so everything has that symmetry. Then you have the death of Christ. This is showing the light that is allowing you to start from his feet, but it's drawing your eyes from dark into light towards the body of Christ. Okay, so going into the techniques and the themes, beauty, like I said, is shown in many ways. One could be in a lot of richness and highlighting a lot of different things, but also it could be very simple as well. Okay, in the bottom right hand corner you can see that richness of the elegance of her dress and robes and all that kind of stuff, but also simple in just a naked body. Okay, emotions are really important. We saw where Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and there's sorrow, right? There's guilt, right? Oftentimes there's also love that comes out, right? Of these emotions. Okay, colors also indicate status. Colors such as white resembles charity. Red means fire or violence. Okay, purple is more like a reverence or royalty. Okay, different colors how they're used is actually implementing a certain message. Perspective, as I mentioned in the last slide, it brings more realism to paintings, where you have parallel lines and there's converging lines and vanishing points, and really it's a mathematical approach to painting, where you're changing from 2D to 3D, as we saw some examples with Sister Wendy. Okay, remember medieval painting was very 2D and it was very flat, and you couldn't really understand like what was going on in the background, except that they were probably just symbolic, and it wasn't that realistic, right? To use light, the mastery of light, right? To have shadows, right, and light come together, gives that depth of field, gives that illusion of how space and dimension works. Okay, and that was kind of what I showed with the death of Christ. So you're taking a pretty simple painting, maybe even a portrait, but even using light and perspective, it makes it way more complex, and it combines what we call realism and complicated themes, and the difficulty level actually is very hard to replicate. Okay, all right. So some of the themes that are going to come out, there's three. The first one is going to be classical paganism. Classical paganism is just showing what the Greco-Roman world really valued, right, in the classical times, where they're painting people in the nude, right, and this is a way that they say it's beautiful, right, and as you see down here in the lower right, this is Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, and it just allows them to see the human anatomy in its full grandeur. Okay, and Michelangelo himself said that the human body and how it is formed, right, is the test of human expression, and showing that if we can see the body just stripped away, beauty could be appreciated at its truest form, because that's how God made them. And so another example is that a lot of classical symbolism is going to be tied to religious themes. In the Sistine Chapel, in the Last Judgment against the wall, we're going to see Christ, which is Jesus, and he's coming in the second coming, and he's here to judge the world. And so Michelangelo, who painted this, is really incorporating history and mythology, but he's combining like the classical gods. As you can see here, this is Jesus actually, right, in his second coming, but he's actually like symbolic, kind of like how Apollo, the Roman god, is being portrayed as well. So he's kind of mixing those two themes together. Other religious themes is going to include the Virgin Mary. Okay, obviously Jesus in different ways. It could be the Bambino, or also different saints. John the Baptist himself would be part of a lot of different types of paintings. He was a patron saint of Florence, and so religious themes were still very prevalent. About 9 out of 10 paintings were still of a religious background, founded on like a religious biblical story. Okay, the reason why is because they were to encourage morality, and so painters were essentially preaching a message, just expressing it through a different type of visual layout. And through this image, right, they can evoke a response that would hopefully spark something in terms of what was right, what was moral, and what was good. Okay. Lastly, you have secular themes, and this is essentially what we talked about, just focusing on the human, right? The human and in their wealth and their current lifestyle and their luxury and their social status, right? But also sometimes artists would paint ordinary people as well, and sometimes artists would paint out of resentment towards the clergy because they want to go against the religious view. So depending upon the artist and their approach and their styling is what we need to look at after we've obtained the different themes, the different techniques, right, the different types of forms of art, and what were they known for, right, and how are they significantly influencing the culture and society around them.